April 25, 1945, Elbe River, Germany. At exactly 11:23 a.m., Staff Sergeant James Reese paused on a low embankment overlooking the water, his M1 Garand slung across his chest, and wiped the mist from his eyes. He thought the shimmer on the far bank was sunlight catching wreckage. Then the shimmer moved. They weren't reflections. They were men. 30 yards across the Elbe, half-shrouded by river fog and scorched willows, a line of figures emerged from the trees. Tall coats, fur hats, a flash of a red star. They were Russian. Reese blinked. The last thing anyone in the 69th Infantry Division expected that morning was to see friendly uniforms emerge from the smoke. 2 days ago, they'd been cutting through the remains of Wehrmacht resistance outside Strela. Then the order came: advance east to the Elbe, but do not cross. Somewhere beyond the river, the Soviet armies were coming from the opposite direction. No one thought it would be today, or that it would look like this. For months, the Americans had fought their way through villages drowned in smoke and rubble. They'd buried friends outside Leipzig and stepped over corpses in Saxony. But now, on the far side of the river, were soldiers who had done the same in a language they couldn't speak, wearing uniforms they didn't recognize, having come from the ruins of a different world. And somehow, in that moment, Reese felt it before he understood it. The war wasn't over. But history had just changed. The Russians waved, not in triumph, not in command. They waved like children discovering something too unreal to process. Reese raised his arm slowly and waved back. Behind him, other GIs gathered, mud-streaked, weapons raised in uncertainty. Lieutenant Jack Henderson approached, binoculars tight to his eyes. He stared across the Elbe for a long moment. "Those aren't Wehrmacht." "No, sir," Reese said quietly. "They're Russians." Henderson exhaled. "Well, I'll be damned." At that moment the fog shifted, and a Russian officer stepped forward, hands raised slightly, not in surrender but in caution. He carried no rifle. He held a field cap. He shouted something across the water. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was. It was a greeting. Not the bark of a command. Not a warning. Not a threat. It was the sound of one soldier recognizing another. Henderson lowered his binoculars. "Get me a damn interpreter," he muttered. Then he looked at Reese. "And get me a white flag." The river was too wide to talk across. But it wasn't too wide to meet. Reese and 2 others started searching for a boat. The Russians did the same. In less than an hour, 2 patrols would meet in the middle. Not as enemies. Not even as allies exactly. As survivors. By 2:06 p.m., a small wooden fishing boat, patched, creaking, half-rotten, had been pushed into the river. 2 American infantrymen sat in the bow, an interpreter huddled behind them, white cloth fastened to a stick. The current was slow, but it pulled east. On the far bank, 5 Russians had gathered. One carried a rifle, but the others were bare-handed. One had flowers tucked into the strap of his torn ammo pouch. Another held a cigarette in his lips, hands shaking. Reese watched from the bank, Garand still slung tight. No one quite knew what this meant. No one had orders for this. And yet every man understood. This was bigger than orders. The boat drifted, oars silent, until it met a second one that had pushed out from the east bank. They met in the center. The 2 boats knocked against each other. Then the Americans and Soviets sat in silence. They stared. And then, as if a signal had been given, they laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the only other option was crying. The Russian officer, Captain Dmitry Fyodorov, reached into his coat and pulled out a flask. He offered it to the American lieutenant. The American declined, then thought better of it. He took the flask. Vodka, brutal, burning, pure. He coughed, passed it back, and the two men shook hands. They spoke in fractured syllables, pieces of words neither could fully understand. But they smiled. The river didn't matter anymore. Back on the banks, Reese watched them toast across the water. Behind him, soldiers began gathering not in formation, but in instinct. Americans in steel pots and olive drab, Russians in tattered coats and boots black with miles. One American radio operator was in tears. Another, a kid from Missouri who hadn't seen combat until February, whispered, "My God, they're real." He had been raised to think of the Russians as a shadow, maybe even a myth. But now they were just men, tired, grimy, human. When the boats returned, they brought stories of Berlin burning, of the siege of Budapest, of Germans who had shot themselves rather than surrender to either side, of Russian tank columns rolling through fields littered with mines and frozen bodies. One Soviet soldier pointed to his chest and thumped it, grinning. "Stalingrad," he said, teeth missing. The Americans fell quiet. They had heard the name. Everyone had. But now it wasn't a place in a newspaper. It was etched into the face of a man offering them a cigarette. They passed rations across the water, Spam, crackers, chocolate. The Russians handed back black bread and a tin of God knows what. They exchanged badges, knives, gloves, patches. One American handed a Soviet his watch. The Russian gave back his belt buckle. That night they camped on opposite sides of the river. Fires flickered in the dark, and though neither side could understand the songs the other sang, they stayed up late listening. Because something had happened that day. Something that didn't need translation. They were strangers, but they had bled through the same war. And no one who stood on the Elbe that afternoon would ever forget it. The morning after their meeting on the river, the Elbe Valley hung in a strange quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't belong to war, but hadn't yet earned peace. Private First Class Will Carney stood beside the rusted wreck of a German half-track, polishing the carbon from his Garen's gas tube with the edge of his sleeve. The day before, he had seen Russian soldiers laugh for the first time in his life. It had felt like discovering a new species. Not the laughter, the humanity behind it. Until that day, every encounter in Europe had ended with a gun. He'd cleared towns in Belgium one room at a time. He'd seen a 16-year-old SS boy shoot two of his friends before they ever breached the wall. But yesterday, on the Elbe, a Russian with gold teeth had hugged him so hard he nearly cracked a rib. And Carney hadn't pulled away. He wasn't the only one struggling to make sense of it. Two jeeps rolled in from the 273rd Infantry's rear elements, kicking up dirt and trailing wire. Lieutenant Colonel Watson stepped out with two aides. His boots sank into the damp riverbank as he stared across the water. No one saluted. No one had the words. Watson adjusted his cap, eyes narrowed. "So, that's the Red Army." Captain Henderson, who had been the first officer to shake hands with the Russians, nodded once. "Sir, they want to build a footbridge, temporary span so patrols can cross without boats." Watson turned slowly. "Who gave them permission?" "No one, they just started doing it." The colonel muttered something under his breath and walked toward the river. Across the Elbe, on the Soviet side, Captain Dmitry Fyodorov was overseeing the construction of a makeshift wooden plank bridge. He barked orders in Russian, gesturing toward the waterline, where engineers were anchoring logs and tying rope. It wasn't elegant, but it would work. Soviet soldiers worked shirtless, pants rolled to their knees, boots sunk in muck. They smoked cheap tobacco and grinned at the Americans watching from the other side. One Russian, squat and scarred, shouted in English, "We come for beer." The GIs erupted in laughter. Someone tossed a crate of Lucky Strikes across the river. Another returned the favor with a bottle of rotgut vodka. Within hours, the bridge was walkable. and with no orders stopping them, men began to cross. They didn't bring rifles. Not at first. Just rations, patches, belts, a harmonica. Sergeant Reese stood beside a Russian with a Lenin badge on his coat and shared a can of peaches. Neither could speak a word of the other's language, but they took turns eating with the same spoon. At some point, someone pulled out a camera. They posed, one American, one Soviet, arms over each other's shoulders like brothers after a long bar fight. When the photos were developed weeks later, that image would be printed in newspapers from New York to Moscow, and none of the men in that frame would ever remember who had snapped it. But not everything that crossed the bridge was warm. By afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Watson received a call from Division Command. The Soviets had entered Torgau. They'd found piles of civilian corpses in a barn, German, butchered, women, children, no uniforms. The Soviets weren't taking prisoners anymore. That night when Carney crossed into the Russian sector, he passed a burned-out farmhouse. No guards, just smoke and flies. Inside the charred walls, he saw what the Soviets had seen, what had driven them to silence. The smell was unforgettable. A Russian sergeant, tall, pale, barely 20, stood beside the ruins with his rifle hanging loose. He looked at Carney and didn't blink. Then he held up a photo, a woman and two girls, and pointed to the house. Carney understood. He didn't need the words. The Red Army had come from ashes. They weren't smiling for peace. They were smiling because the killing had finally stopped. The next morning, orders arrived. No more unsupervised crossing. The generals were coming. Eisenhower wanted coordination. Stalin wanted documentation. The handshake had become a photo op. Still men crossed, quietly, on foot in twos. Private First Class Michael Tenner, a Brooklyn Jew who had lost 3 uncles to the camps, sat beside a Soviet major who had marched into Auschwitz. They didn't speak, but Tenner passed him a chocolate bar and the man wept openly. Neither had expected to survive the war. Now they sat beside a river, alive. And neither could say why that made them feel more hollow than whole. April 27th. General Omar Bradley arrived by jeep. He walked the river's edge with a small escort, his boots sinking into the same dirt that Carney had knelt in just 2 days earlier. He shook hands with General Ivan Kolesnikov on the footbridge. Cameras flashed. A band played. Flags were unfurled. The war was almost over. Berlin was falling. But none of the soldiers watching the generals that day could shake the feeling that something deeper had happened on that riverbank, something that no press release would ever capture. Because no one remembered the speeches. They remembered the peach can. The bottle passed back and forth. The handshake between 2 men who didn't speak the same tongue, but both knew exactly how it felt to crawl through hell and make it out breathing. That night, as rain rolled in from the east, Carney sat in his foxhole and cleaned his rifle. The Garin lay across his lap, still muddy from Leipzig. He stared across the dark river. Somewhere out there, the Russians were doing the same. He wondered if someday he'd fight beside them again. Or against them. But in that moment, there was no enemy. No politics. Just the river. The silence. And a handshake no one would ever forget. The rain came down steady for 2 days. It coated everything, rifles, boots, mess tins, until the Elbe became less a river and more a swollen seam of gray water cutting through the heart of a dying empire. The bridge, once a symbol of spontaneous brotherhood, now looked like it belonged to another war. Sentries had been posted. Crossings were logged. Soviet guards checked names. American MPs stood with arms folded. Still, the soldiers passed stories when the officers weren't looking. Reese gave his last pack of Chesterfields to a Red Army lieutenant with frostbitten hands. In return, he received a flask of bitter coffee thick with grounds and ash. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. They understood. But something had shifted. The warmth from that first handshake hadn't vanished, but it had receded, like heat from a fire you were no longer allowed to stand near. The first misunderstanding came on the 29th. A squad of Americans from Company B wandered east of the Elbe chasing what they thought were German holdouts. They weren't supposed to cross, but no one stopped them. They didn't find Germans. They found a Soviet patrol, 4 men, one of them bleeding from a neck wound. The Americans offered help: bandages, sulfa, water, but something in the exchange broke. It started with raised voices. Then a Russian stepped forward, waving a pistol and shouting in slurred syllables. The American squad leader pointed to his own medic, palms up. "Help, we can help." More shouting, the pistol remained pointed. Eventually, the Americans backed away. No one got shot, but when they crossed back to the West Bank, they didn't talk much. "Wasn't war," one of them said later, but it wasn't peace either. A rumor spread that same day. 2 Soviet officers had shot a German family hiding in a hay barn. Mother, father, 2 boys under 10. When asked why, the interpreter's reply was short. They had Nazi badges, partisans. No one verified the story. No one filed a report. But the American sergeant, who saw the bodies, wouldn't sleep for 3 nights. Carney walked the bank that evening, helmet off, Garand slung, watching the sun dissolve behind ruined spires. Somewhere beyond the tree line, he heard distant thunder, not from the sky, but from artillery. Berlin was still fighting. In every other direction, the war was over. But not there. Not yet. A Soviet major approached from the far side of the bridge, flanked by 2 guards. He was young, but his face was leathered like old stone. His uniform was pressed, but the boots were torn. He didn't offer a handshake. He offered a document, typed in Cyrillic, signed in ink. The interpreter translated softly. "All units west of the Elbe must stay west. Crossing without authorization will be seen as interference. Orders from Moscow." Carney said nothing. The Soviet officer stared for a moment longer, then turned and walked back across the bridge. The river was still there, but the current had changed. May 1st, 1945. Word came from the Soviet side. Adolf Hitler was dead. Shot, burned, gone. The news spread through the American ranks like lightning. Some men cheered. Some didn't know how to feel. Reese sat on an overturned ammo crate, chewing dry bread and staring at nothing. "I thought it'd feel bigger," he said. Carney sat beside him. "So did I." They both knew why it didn't. It wasn't just about a man. It was about everything that had died along the way: friends, brothers, strangers. 100 towns turned to ash. You couldn't celebrate with that much smoke still in your lungs. That night, flares lit up the eastern sky. Red, white, gold. Soviet artillery boomed somewhere in the distance, not at enemies but in victory. They had taken Berlin. The Red Army had reached the heart of the Reich. The Americans watched from their side of the Elbe, no longer participants, just spectators. No one said it, but everyone felt it. The handshake had ended. The next war hadn't begun, but the bridge now felt like a fault line. 2 days later, Eisenhower arrived. His convoy rolled up with fanfare and MPs, generals in pressed uniforms, Polish drivers, an interpreter who spoke French and German and Russian but didn't speak fatigue. Eisenhower didn't cross the bridge. He met the Soviet brass in the middle, shook hands, posed for photographs, smiled when necessary. Behind the cameras, soldiers watched in silence. None of them cheered. The applause was reserved, the words scripted, the moment real but the meaning filtered. Afterward, the footbridge was dismantled. Engineers tore down the planks, ropes were coiled. By the next morning, only ripples remained. Carney stood at the edge of the river that night, his boots in the same place they'd been on April 25th. Across the Elbe, the Russian campfires still flickered. Someone was singing, low, melancholy, a ballad maybe, a lullaby. He didn't know the words, but he understood the meaning. He wondered if the Russians could hear him thinking. He wondered if they still remembered the handshake. He knew he always would. They didn't call it the last patrol, but everyone knew it was. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. The papers had been signed in Reims. Germany had surrendered officially, completely. But along the Elbe, no one cheered. There were no horns, no champagne, no dancing in the mud. Instead, 2 American soldiers, Will Carney and Staff Sergeant Reese, walked their side of the river one last time. No rifles, just sidearms and the weight of 6 months too long. Across the water, Soviet sentries watched from dugouts cut into the ridge. The bridge was gone. Patrols no longer crossed, but the silence between them wasn't hostile. It was something worse. It was quiet indifference. Carney stopped near the old crossing site. A single wooden plank remained, half submerged in mud. He stared at it like it might still carry a man. "You think they miss us?" he asked Reese. Reese didn't answer. He lit a cigarette and watched the smoke drift east. "I do," Carney muttered. "Not all of 'em, but some." 2 weeks earlier, a Soviet private had handed him a photo. A woman and child, somewhere in Smolensk maybe. The private had taken it back a moment later, nodded once and walked off. Carney didn't know the man's name. He never saw him again. And that was how it was now. Each day fewer Russians showed their faces. The campfires dwindled. Music stopped. Then one morning, the Soviets simply weren't there anymore. No trucks, no engines, just empty ground. A cold breeze blew across the river, and where once there had been laughter and toasts, there was only the wind, pulling at scraps of canvas and leaves. The Americans stayed longer, too long. They were told the delay was administrative. Eisenhower was negotiating zones. Stalin was remapping borders. Someone in London was redrawing Czechoslovakia. So they waited. And as they waited, stories filtered in. A German girl, maybe 15, stumbled into the American lines near Strela. Her face was bruised, her hands trembling. She spoke no English, but the translator caught 2 words: Russisch Soldat. She didn't ask for help, she just stood there. One GI gave her a blanket, another handed her a tin of sardines. She took neither. Eventually, a medic wrapped her in a poncho and led her away. No report was filed. But the rumors spread fast, faster than orders. And with each new whisper, the memory of the Elbe handshake dimmed a little more. Reese received a package from home, a letter from his sister, a clipping from the Chicago Tribune. Yanks and Reds embrace at Elbe, symbol of unity. He looked at the photo, at his own mud-smeared face beside a Russian captain whose name he couldn't pronounce. He remembered the vodka, the songs, the absurdity of grinning with a man who carried a TT-33 and had fought through Stalingrad. He stared at the caption, Unity. Then he folded the paper and tossed it in the fire. Somewhere east the camps were being opened. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen. The photographs hadn't reached the Elbe yet, but the stories had. American medics were vomiting in the fields. War photographers were breaking down. Some of the Russians had seen them already. They had said nothing. The longer the Americans stayed, the more the cracks widened. 2 Soviet officers entered the American zone uninvited, demanding to inspect a German officer rumored to be in custody. The MP at the checkpoint turned them away. One of the Russians spat on the ground. An American corporal later said they watched him drag a civilian boy behind a shed. Nothing came of it. But no one forgot it either. Still, there were flickers, brief moments when the weight lifted. Carney found a Soviet belt buckle in the dirt where the old bridge used to be. He cleaned it, turned it over, and saw an inscription scratched into the back. Just 2 words. WW2 Until we meet again. Weeks passed, orders came, units rotated. The 69th was told to prepare for redeployment. Some whispered it would be the Pacific. Others said Japan would fall before they got there. Reese packed his gear in silence. Carney folded the belt buckle into his shirt pocket. He didn't know why. On their last night by the Elbe, they built a fire. No music, no speech, just a handful of GIs sitting in the dirt, passing around a dented flask and pretending, for 1 hour, that they could unfeel everything they'd seen. Reese stared into the flames. He said, "You think we'll see M again?" Carney didn't answer right away. He looked across the river. The far bank was dark. No campfires, no guards, no laughter. Only the wind. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe not as friends." Reese took a long drink. God help us if that's true. By July, the river was just a river again. The fords had dried up. The last American boots had pulled out of Saxony. The Red Army now patrolled both sides of the Elbe, their banners raised in towns where swastikas had once flown. The Americans had gone west, some bound for Paris, some for Munich, others for New York or for Okinawa. There were no more handshakes, no more vodka traded for cigarettes, no more songs shared over shared fire. The world had stopped clapping. And for Will Carney, nothing felt real until he got home. He stepped off the train in Chicago with a duffel bag on one shoulder and 2 medals in his pocket. His parents stood on the platform with flags in their hands, and smiles stretched thin from too many months of waiting. There was hugging. There was pie. There were parades on Main Street with brass bands and little girls in red, white, and blue dresses. But none of it felt like the river. He tried to explain it once, to an uncle who'd served in the last war. "They looked just like us," Carney had said. "Same eyes, same boots, same look when they laughed like they weren't sure they were allowed to." The uncle had nodded and changed the subject. Carney didn't bring it up again. In Moscow, a photograph made the front page of Pravda. It showed a Soviet lieutenant, arms slung around an American GI, both grinning, mud on their knees. The caption read, "Brothers of Victory." No one knew the lieutenant's name. The GI was never identified. Carney saw the photo years later in a used bookshop in Ohio, tucked between pages of a memoir. He stared at it for 5 minutes before realizing it wasn't him, but it could have been. Something stuck. He kept the Soviet belt buckle in a tin box under his bed. Alongside it, a cigarette tin filled with Elbe mud, dried to dust. A sketch of a woman's face drawn on the back of a K ration label, gifted by a Russian private who never gave a name. And once a year, every April, he walked alone to the edge of Lake Michigan with a bottle of cheap vodka and drank to the sound of the wind. He never told anyone why. In 1947, word came through a contact in Berlin. The Russians had sealed the eastern sector. No American was allowed within 10 kilometers of the Elbe without orders. The bridge had never been rebuilt. Carney read the telegram and stared out the window for a long time. He hadn't expected a reunion, but he'd hoped the river might remain a place where hands could still meet. Now it was a line again. In 1950, he read that a Soviet major had defected in Vienna. The article said he'd served through Stalingrad and Torgau, had shaken hands with Americans on the Elbe. Carney clipped the story and pinned it to the inside of his closet. He never said why. His wife never asked. By the time the Korean War began, no one talked about the Elbe anymore. Children were taught about the Cold War. about the Iron Curtain, about bombs that could vaporize cities, about generals and treaties and threats wrapped in diplomatic ice. But no teacher ever said that once. For 2 days in April 1945, men who didn't share a language or a flag had traded chocolate for black bread and hugged like brothers after surviving hell. In 1961, when the Berlin Wall went up, Carney was working at a steel plant. He watched the television footage, the barbed wire, the concrete, the guards, and he felt something in his chest he couldn't name. He went home that night, opened the tin box under his bed and took out the belt buckle. He ran his thumb over the letters again. WW2 until we meet again. He didn't know if that was still true. The last time he saw the Elbe was in 1985. He was 63, retired. A veterans group had arranged a commemorative visit. The Soviets allowed it. A small ceremony, speeches, wreaths, the usual. But he didn't care about the generals. He walked away from the group, down a muddy slope to the place where the old footbridge had once stood. The trees were taller, the bank had shifted, but he knew the spot. He sat there for a while in the silence and listened, not for voices, not for music, just for the memory. A young Russian's laugh. A bottle passed hand to hand. A handshake that meant something, if only for a breath in time. He never wrote a book, never gave interviews, never stood on a podium. But he told his grandson, once, in a quiet moment, "You'll hear a lot about the Cold War, about missiles and spies and walls. But before any of that, before all the ice, there was one day when 2 armies laid down their guns and said hello." He smiled. "I was there, and no matter what came after, nobody can take that day away." Across the sea, on the far side of what had once been the Elbe line, an old Russian soldier sat in a kitchen in Smolensk. He poured a glass of vodka, lit a cigarette, and stared at a photo faded with time. It showed 2 men, one in Soviet gray, one in American green, arms over each other's shoulders, mud on their boots, smiles on their faces. No caption, no date. But the old man remembered. And he whispered, in a voice hoarse with smoke and memory, "WW2 until we meet again." It wasn't until 1995 that Carney finally returned to the Elbe again. He had meant to go sooner. In '85 he'd stood on the bank for the ceremony, but that had been politics, flags, speeches, cameras. He'd smiled, posed, shaken hands, but he'd never gone back to the spot, not the real one. Now 50 years had passed. The bridge was back, stone now, not wood. Cars rolled across it. Schoolchildren threw rocks into the current below. East Germany was gone. So was the Soviet Union. The red star had vanished from the buildings. New signs hung where painted hammers and sickles had once been carved into the walls. But the river still ran the same, wide, steady, unbothered by memory. Carney stood by the railing, his hands wrapped around a cane, and looked out across the water. He didn't expect to find anything. He wasn't here for that. He was here to remember what didn't fit in museums. A young woman approached, dark jacket, clean pressed badge on her lapel. She asked if he had served. He nodded once. She asked if he was here in '45. Again he nodded. "Did you meet the Soviets?" she asked. He smiled, shook one's hand, toasted with another, gave a third my last chocolate bar. She smiled politely, lifted her notepad. "Can I ask what you remember most?" He looked back at the river for a long moment, and then said softly, "We stopped shooting." She blinked. "Sir." "That day, that hour, that minute. We stopped shooting, not just us, them too. We looked across the water and saw soldiers, not enemies, not reds, not threats, just men, tired, hollow-eyed, worn thin, but alive." He paused. "That's what I remember." She thanked him, scribbled something, and moved on. Probably thought she needed a better quote, a soundbite. He didn't mind, he hadn't said it for her. In Moscow, in a quiet neighborhood north of the city center, a man named Fyodorov sat by a window, peeling an apple with a knife older than most of his neighbors. He kept a faded photo above his desk, two men in a boat, one American, one Soviet, both laughing, one holding a can of peaches, the other a flask. He never told his grandchildren about it. When they asked, he said it was a fishing trip. But once a year, every April, he poured 2 shots of vodka, one for himself, one for the man in the photo. He drank them both, then stood and saluted. Carney died in 2004, quietly, a winter heart attack, folded laundry still on the machine. At the funeral, a neighbor spoke, said he was quiet, polite, a man who liked the smell of coffee and the way snow looked on pine trees. The army sent a flag, folded it neatly. No one mentioned the river or the handshake. But on his dresser, the family found an old tin box. Inside, a Soviet belt buckle, a field sketch of a Russian girl's face, a belt loop, and a handwritten note. 4 words, blocky and simple. I was there, Elbe. The world went on. New wars came, new lines were drawn. But the river stayed. And sometimes, when the wind moves right, just right, you can almost hear it. The sound of voices shouting across the water. A laugh. A name. A handshake. Not a treaty, not a surrender. Just 2 men meeting in the middle of a river, saying without saying. We made it. We're still here. And for a brief, shining moment, the war let them be human again.